In October of 2017, a man sat quietly in the corner of a halfway house in Los Angeles. He wasn't an ordinary resident. His name was James Allen Hayes, and just a few years earlier, he had been the picture of success, a $19 million lottery winner. But now, he wasn't being celebrated for his wealth. He was being arrested.
A former $19 million lottery jackpot winner pleaded guilty Thursday to 4 federal counts of bank robbery.
The sound of handcuffs echoed through the room as FBI agents moved in. Hayes didn't resist. He simply looked down, avoiding their stares. They called him the PT Cruiser Bandit, a nickname given for his choice of getaway car. Over the past 6 months, Hayes had robbed 11 banks across Southern California, leaving law enforcement baffled by his calm, methodical approach. But to those who knew him, the revelation was almost impossible to believe. How could a man who had everything, millions of dollars, a chance at a better life, end up here? And what pushed him to trade the life of a millionaire for the life of a criminal? James Allen Hayes wasn't the type of man who turned heads. A quiet, unassuming guard in Ventura, California, he lived a modest, uneventful life. His days were predictable. Long hours at work, evenings spent alone in his small apartment, and the occasional lottery ticket purchased out of habit. To those who knew him, Hayes was polite but distant, a man who kept to himself and never seemed to aim for more. But on September 23, 1998, everything changed. On a whim, Hayes had bought another ticket, just like he'd done dozens of times before. This one, however, was different. When he checked his numbers, he couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't just win, he had hit the jackpot. $19 million. The media frenzy was immediate. Reporters crowded around him as he held up the oversized check, a smile plastered across his face. For a moment, Hayes became a symbol of hope, the living embodiment of the American dream. "This is going to change everything," he told a reporter, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief. And it did, but not in the way he imagined. For the first time in his life, Hayes had options. He bought a new car, moved into a beachfront property, and indulged in luxuries he'd only dreamed of. Trips to Las Vegas, expensive dinners, and endless shopping sprees became the norm. But beneath the surface of his newfound wealth, cracks began to show. He had no financial plan, no one to guide him, and no understanding of how to manage millions. His modest personality left him vulnerable to his own impulses. And then there was the isolation. Money didn't solve Hayes' loneliness, it amplified it. He began to drift further into himself, and as the months went on, he discovered something that gave him an escape: heroin. The lottery had handed him $19 million and the chance at a better life, but it also handed him the tools for his own destruction. It didn't take long for the cracks to turn into a full-blown collapse. By the mid-2000s, James Allen Hayes' $19 million fortune was gone. The beachfront property, the luxury cars, the trips to Las Vegas, sold off one by one to pay for mounting debts and an insatiable heroin addiction. The man who once stood in front of cameras as a lottery winner now found himself barely scraping by. Hayes moved out of his dream home and into a series of cheap apartments, each one smaller and shabbier than the last. He pawned his belongings, avoided old friends, and spent days chasing the next high. His addiction wasn't just destroying his body, it was isolating him completely. And then the debts kept piling up. Bills went unpaid, eviction notices arrived, and the money that was burned through so casually was now a distant memory. By 2017, Hayes had nothing left. Not his wealth, not his dignity, and not his future. But what he did have was desperation. And with nothing left to lose, James Allen Hayes made a choice that would shock everyone who had ever heard his name. In April 2017, James Allen Hayes stepped into a quiet bank in Santa Clarita, California, clutching a handwritten note. His heart pounded as he approached the teller. His face was calm, almost emotionless, but inside, fear gripped him. He slid the note across the counter. It was short and direct. "Give me the cash and no one gets hurt." The teller froze for a moment, then nervously began emptying the drawer. Less than 2 minutes later, Hayes walked out with $2,000 stuffed into his pocket. This was the first time Hayes had committed a crime in his life. The rush of adrenaline mixed with the crushing shame of desperation. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He just wanted enough money to keep going. But as the cash ran out, so did his hesitation. By the time he walked into his second bank a few weeks later, Hayes was more composed. The same method: a note, no weapons, and a quiet exit. This time, he left with nearly $4,000. The pattern continued. Bank after bank, he'd show up in the early afternoon, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses to avoid being recognized. He didn't speak much, keeping his requests simple to avoid suspicion. He wasn't violent and he wasn't reckless, but he was desperate. As his addiction grew, so did his need for cash. The small sums from each robbery barely lasted a week. By his third robbery, Hayes had developed a signature style. Investigators noted the way he always used a handwritten note and avoided using weapons, opting for a calm demeanor to avoid drawing attention. But one thing stood out most: his getaway vehicle. Hayes relied on an old PT Cruiser, a detail that would eventually lead to his nickname, the PT Cruiser Bandit. Law enforcement began piecing together his movements, identifying similarities in his methods. But Hayes wasn't done. Over the next few months, Hayes robbed banks across Southern California, from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara. Each heist followed the same formula: quiet entrances, unassuming exits, and a focus on avoiding confrontation. But with each robbery, his confidence grew. He began taking larger risks, targeting banks closer to urban areas where security was tighter. By the sixth robbery, the FBI had officially launched an investigation, linking the crimes to the same man. They just didn't know who he was yet. Despite his attempts to stay under the radar, Hayes couldn't avoid the cameras. Surveillance footage captured grainy images of an older man, usually wearing a hat or hood to obscure his features. Investigators analyzed his movements, tracking his habits and patterns. But Hayes was careful, avoiding any bank he had previously targeted and ensuring his heists were quick, lasting no longer than 3 minutes. In total, Hayes robbed 11 banks between April and September of 2017, collecting thousands of dollars to sustain his addiction. The amounts weren't extravagant, $2,000 here, $4,000 there, but they were enough to keep him going. With each robbery, he knew he was pushing his luck. The FBI was closing in, and local law enforcement agencies were sharing information. The net was tightening. His final robbery came in September 2017 at a small bank in Santa Barbara. This time, something was different. The staff had been warned about a series of robberies in the area and were prepared to cooperate without panic. Hayes handed over his note, collected the cash, and left within moments. But outside, an off-duty police officer noticed his PT Cruiser idling in the parking lot. Suspicious, the officer took down the license plate number. October 4th, 2017. The halfway house where James Allen Hayes had been living was quiet. Until it wasn't. FBI agents surrounded the building, their radios crackling as they prepared to make the arrest. Hayes was sitting alone in a small room, but didn't even try to run. When the agents burst through the door, he simply looked up, resigned. It was over. At first, the residents and staff of the halfway house couldn't believe what they were hearing. The quiet, unassuming man they knew as James was being arrested as the infamous PT Cruiser Bandit. The news spread quickly, and within hours, the media had descended, eager to get a glimpse of the lottery winner turned bank robber. But Hayes wasn't talking. As he was escorted into custody, he remained silent, his face betraying no emotion. During his interrogation, Hayes admitted to everything: the robberies, the addiction, the desperation. He explained how he had lost everything after winning the lottery, how his fortune had slipped through his fingers, leaving him nothing but regret. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said. "I just didn't know what else to do." His confession painted a picture of a man broken by his own choices and circumstances. In court, Hayes faced federal charges for 11 bank robberies. Prosecutors described him as a calculated criminal, while his defense attorney argued that he was a man driven to extremes by addiction and poverty. Hayes pleaded guilty, avoiding a lengthy trial. When the judge handed down his sentence, 33 months in federal prison, he nodded quietly, showing little reaction. But what stood out most during the trial wasn't Hayes' defense or even his sentencing. It was the stark contrast between the man he was and the man he had become. Reporters couldn't help but bring up his lottery win, the $19 million that had made him a symbol of hope. "How does this happen?" one journalist asked. "How does someone lose it all?" James Allen Hayes' story isn't just about a man who lost $19 million. It's a story about how sudden wealth doesn't solve problems. It magnifies them. For Hayes, the lottery wasn't a ticket to freedom. It was the beginning of a slow descent into isolation, addiction, and desperation. The money gave him everything he thought he wanted, but in the end, it took away what little he had. Today, James Allen Hayes is free, but the legacy of his choices remains, and his story leaves us with one lingering question. Was the lottery his greatest stroke of luck, or his greatest misfortune?